you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Mark is not going to be here today, and he asked me to pinch hit for him. He and his wife both, I think, got COVID. Mark's not having a lot of symptoms, but his wife lost taste and smell, which I guess is a classic example. So, but anyway, he asked me to pinch hit for him. When I took a look at the bio for our speaker, I was kind of impressed. You know, Ken has been here before, but he's a member of the Pittsburgh Railroad and Technical Historical Society. But when I read his opening paragraph, it made me start to think. We live on a 25,000-mile wide ball, and the sun is fixed. Everything operates by time. Can you imagine if there was no universal system of time, and 2 o'clock didn't mean the same thing to you as it does to me? It'd be utter chaos. That's what he wants to talk about, and how Pittsburgh contributed to establishing a time zone. So with that, please welcome Ken.
Thank you. How about I'll stand here and operate this from right here, all right? We do the lights.
Yeah, the light command. There we go, that's good.
Yeah, well, anyhow, that's a picture of Allegheny Observatory when it was up on top of Federal Street, and that played a big role in this. So, there are lots of different kinds of time. You probably don't know this, because we're just used to looking at our watches and just figuring everything is hunky-dory. But way back when there were no electronics or anything, people used the sundial, and that actually has a name to it called the parent solar time, sundial time. So back then, you know, it wasn't like, I'll see you at 5 to 2. I'll see you next week or next month or next year, or maybe we'll meet again. So that parent solar time is called sundial time. So there's a second kind of time that's called mean solar time, and that's frequently called clock time. So clock time is not necessarily better than a sundial, except that it averages out the problems of a sundial, and you could use it at night besides. So, but the problem is with a clock, or clocks of that day, was that they were notoriously unreliable because they speeded up, they slowed down because of heat, because of cold, because of lubrication, because of humidity. So there are all kind of reasons why they changed time. They speed it up or slow down, and they were incorrect. But you didn't know why, you know. So, this photograph is talking to the difference between a sundial time and mean solar time, clock time. And there is a difference. And this figure 8, what was happening here is somebody went out and took a picture of the sun in the sky at the same time every few days. And so the sun actually makes a figure 8 in the sky. It's called the analemma. It has a name to it. And so if you would use a sundial or you would use a clock, you would get a difference in the time, as much as 20 minutes difference. This analemma has, so the first time this was ever done was about 30 years ago, and the guy took the photograph from the same spot at the same time for an entire year, but digital cameras didn't exist. So when he got done taking the pictures, he found out he made a mistake. So he had to go back the next time, the next year, and take pictures all over again. So because of this variability, the sun would not be a good thing to base time on. And so if you ever looked at a globe, I'm sure you've seen this, figure 8 on the globe, that's the analemma. So it would be straight up and down if you would have taken the photographs at noon. So the problem is with the sun has to do with the Earth. The Earth is inclined in its orbit about 40 degrees. And so this shows a whole year. And so these two views of the Earth here from this candle is the sun, is the equinoxes, the spring and the fall equinoxes. And the one on the right is just happened a few days ago. It's the first day of summer. And the one on the left is the first day of winter. Now, we all know the Earth rotates in a day, once a day, right? And that, how much time is that? Everybody knows.
24.
Does everybody agree 24 hours? 24 hours? Well, that is absolutely wrong. The Earth rotates once in 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.09 seconds. So we get to this problem of, you know, we can't go by, the day like that. So we'll just round it up, okay? We figure we'll just round it up. But the problem with rounding it up is that every little bit more than 6 months or so, noon would be at midnight, and midnight would be at noon, just for 4 minutes a day. Just figure out how many minutes are in a day, and you'll see that the noon will change. So, and that's what people are concerned with is noon. That's when as the sun passes across the sky, there's arc. At the peak of the arc, that's called noon. So, what do we do about that? So there's this thing now, we have a third time, sidereal time, and that's sidereal means star time. So if you were to look up in the sky at a star, and so you look at it, I'll get a little bit more into it, and what you do is use stars to find out time. And the reason why we needed accurate time at that time, several centuries ago, and the British worked on this, is that if you use the charts in the positions of the planets, the moon and sun in the sky from a ship, and your clock was wrong, you would head in the wrong direction, in which is a good chance that your clock would be wrong for various reasons that I've said. So it was important that they knew accurate time. And they developed clocks in England to be accurate to a second a week. So that was okay. But how did they do that? You know, how do you know that the clock is accurate to a second a week? How do you prove that? And it's just a little bit into a problem of this whole thing is, so I said the Earth rotates once in 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.09 seconds. So if I'm looking here and I'm going to rotate once and I get back here. That's at 24 hours. The problem is the Earth is moving in its orbit around the sun. So now I'm over here, and so when I rotate once, you know, the sun is here, or the stars are here, but the sun isn't, because the sun is over there. I was pointing to the sun over there. So it takes me about 4 minutes to turn for the sun to be in the same point in the sky as it was the day before. And that's why we have a 24-hour day. Because we're solar people. We don't live by the stars, we're sleeping. So it's important to us that the sun be the prominent thing in the sky, and that's why we arrived at that. However, that varies a little bit, as I said. So the big reason in the States that we were interested in the time is because of railroads. And railroads operated by schedules. So, you know, you got a big railroad out here, the Pennsylvania Railroad ran through here, outside, and there was a schedule that says, okay, train going from Pittsburgh to Cleveland. Stop in Swickley at so-and-so a time, wait for a train coming from Cleveland to Pittsburgh. And if there is a problem, then you wait there a certain amount of time, and then there's all kind of rules that develop. But if I had a clock that said, you know, that was 5 minutes different from that guy, and we listened to all the rules, and we still have a wreck. So you needed accurate time. That's why a railroader's watch was a very important thing. It was to make up, to know the correct time. So a railroader was either given a watch or required to buy a watch that was very accurate, and to maintain that watch, and that when he went on duty, that he was supposed to check his watch against the station clock, so that everybody had the right time. So the problem is, how do we get the right time out to the stations? So as I said, this was done to prevent wrecks. Because the rules say, come to a place, wait for, you know, until this train comes and passes, and if it doesn't come in with X amount of time, then you have the right of track. So lots of rules were evolved. I mean, these are just some of the rules that I picked out to tell you that this is, but the rule book that I got was about this thick. And so every time an accident happened, they made another rule. You know, and so it becomes bigger, more complicated. You work with the rule book and with the timetable. Remember, there were no radios. Telegraph was just in its infancy. So you had to have something that you had to be able to rely on. But Rex was the cause of all this. So some of the solution came from a man named Samuel P. Langley. He was the director of that Allegheny Observatory, which I showed you the picture of. He developed what was called the Allegheny Time System for Allegheny Observatory. He was a scientist. He was a solar planetary expert. He was an inventor. He invented something called the bolometer. I'll talk to you about that in a second. He was an aerodynamicist. What does that mean? And he became secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. So if you were a betting man back at the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th century, and you were going to bet on who was going to be the first person to fly a heavier than aircraft, meaning airplane, it would have been Langley. I mean, the government had invested $50,000 in him already to do experiments. At Allegheny Observatory, he developed something called the whirling table, which developed the thought of drag. And so it was from there. The Wright brothers came to him to talk about drag and lift, which was just being developed. And he had a big role in that, and he was noted for it. This bolometer thing was developed here in Pittsburgh, and it was a device that you point a telescope at the sun, and you could measure the output of the sun on a meter, on a galvanometer. So before that time, everybody was guessing. They used to put ice out on a block of ice, a weighed block of ice, out in the sun and let it sit there until it melted. And when it melted, that meant it took this much energy to melt the ice, and that's what the output of the sun is. So this was a direct reading of it. You know, when they were trying to calculate before that in the 1800s, they were trying to calculate the output of the sun, and they talked about how many tons of coal it was burning. So, I mean, that's the way they were thinking, you know. They didn't know how the sun worked, and so the best thought in their mind was it's a pile of coal that's burning. So Langley did that. Another guy that was of interest in this was a man named William Thaw. He was an industrialist. He was a philanthropist. He was on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad, vice president of Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, Chicago Railway, which is the road outside here. He was president of the Pennsylvania Company, which was a holding company for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His part owner of Pittsburgh and Steubenville Railroad. And he was the chairman of the Observatory Committee for the Western University of Pennsylvania, which was up on the hill above the north side. That's where Pitt was located back then. And Thaw was probably, although he's not well known, back in the 1800s, he was probably the biggest philanthropist in Pittsburgh. So he was a very important man. He died in 1890s. If you go to Allegheny County College, Community College, there's a Thaw Hall. That's where he lived on the north side. So Thaw had a son, Bill, and a son, Harry, but I'm not going to talk about his son, Bill, but I'm going to talk about his grandson, Bill, a little. This is just an aside from this story. Bill was a member of the Lafayette Escadrille. He was a pilot who flew for the French in World War I before America got involved in being in World War I. So he's a brave man. He was an ace pilot in World War I. On the other hand, there's Thaw's son, Harry. Harry, a murdered architect of the Penn Station in New York, at Stanford White. He did it in broad daylight in front of witnesses over a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Nesbit, and oddly, she was from Tarentum. She was a Gibson girl. There's 2 movies about this whole scenario, The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing and Ragtime. And you can see on the lower left there is Nesbeth, pretty good-looking woman, and Harry ended up marrying her. Harry was a little bit off when I said that. But White was playing wrong. He played the women, and so Harry didn't agree with that, so he killed him. So Harry's mother got him off on temporary insanity. So he spent some time in a sanatorium that was really a, country club up in the mountains of Allegheny Mountains. And very shortly after that, he was declared sane, and so he got away with murder. I don't want to talk about that. However, we're going to get to the thing about developing the time system. And what you use to tell time is a transit telescope. So this transit telescope, you can see it can only move up and down. It can't move side to side. Very specific reason for that. It had crosshairs in it like a rifle scope. So if you saw a star pass the crosshairs in the telescope and you marked down the time, and then you waited till the next day and you did the same thing for the star and you marked the time, well, that has to be 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.09 seconds, because that's how much time it takes the Earth to rotate. What do you do with it? Well, this is the Allegheny Observatory. The transit telescope was in that room to the left. You see the narrow slots. Those were doors that opened up because the telescope's not moving this way or that, back side to side. So you only needed a narrow slot to measure stars. They were called time stars. And you could open the roof the same way. The dome in the middle is a 13-inch Fritz refractor, which is up the new observatory, and you can go look through that to this day. And here is an actual photograph of the setup when it was moved to Riverview Park, where it is now. And when I was a young fellow, I volunteered at the observatory, and I used to sit in that chair all the time. I had no clue as to what it is. As a matter of fact, they trashed it. I don't know, it's this historically significant piece of equipment. Another view the other way. The telescope itself is still at Allegheny Observatory, and if you go, they're starting to have open nights now again. So if you go up there, you can go up and see this historic equipment. And you have to have something called the sidereal clock. So this looks like it's 24 hours in the 23 hours, 56 minutes. So you would check it against this clock. If that clock was right, then you're good. If that clock is wrong, well, now you have to adjust it. They would adjust it by putting weights on the pendulum, taking weights off the pendulum, just like they do at Big Ben. Again, there's a little bit better view. You can see that slot on the left. This is the Allegheny Observatory at present, and that little shack off to the right, that was the transit house. See, you need two clocks for this. You need a sidereal clock. And see, even to this day, astronomers use sidereal time, because if they point by solar time, the star's going to be over here, and they're going to be looking here, and it's going to work out. So you need to know sidereal time to point telescopes. So it's important to them. And the sidereal clock is on the right, and the solar clock is on the left. So now, there's only one day a year where these two clocks will read the same. And that is because these are 24-hour clocks. Otherwise, it would be 2 days a year. But That's where that cross is on the analemma. That's when the days are equal. And so what you did is you checked the sidereal time against the solar time. However, to make sure that it's correct, you have to account for that almost 4 minutes a day difference. So, on the equinox, the clocks will read the same. Then the next day, you check the clocks and you have to account for this almost 4 minutes at a time. 2 days later, you have to account for almost 8 minutes, 12 minutes, etc. So you can check one clock against the other after you make compensation for it. So they had something called a chronograph, and that just simply means this drum. It was a drum recorder, and they affixed a little switch to the second gear on the clock, on both of them. And so every time a second ticked, they press the switch and you would get electrical signal and it would put it out to the drum, and so you get these series of lines. And they'd both be on there at the same time, and you could make a comparison to how far they're off from each other, etc. And you can compensate the clocks, both clocks, then to have the correct time. So, what you did with it then is that little electrical signal was then put out, and it, on the left, that brass board, that is a switchboard. So you would send it out to different people by pressing that. And what it did is the electrical impulse from the clock hit this key, solenoid for a key, and that's a telegraph key. And so you would broadcast these click, click, clicks out on to the telegraph lines. And so and you see, the stuff is weight driven. It's all weight driven. They didn't have electricity back then, except in batteries. So what happened is, so what in the world can click, 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 click on a line tell you? Ooh. What time is it? Click, 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 click. I don't know. So who knows? But originally, Langley made it so that he could directly change a clock across the telegraph line. That they set up the experiment with Harvard College Observatory, and then that's where Langley was from, in that area. And so he could control a clock. He could speed it up, slow it down at Harvard College over the telegraph line. But Americans being what Americans are, what do you think somebody said? What are you doing that for? Don't you know how valuable that telegraph line is? I could be making money. Why do you keep a whole line tied up for time? So they had to reinvent this. So what they did is they made a system, whereas there's the 59th tooth on the clock second gear was shaved light so that it didn't depress the switch, so that you would get this click, 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 click. And that was set up so that you get a block of time, usually about 15 minutes in advance, but I think it lasted more for 5 minutes or so, that would tell you that we're going to do time. All the railroaders in these signal towers would broadcast time across the whole system, and all the messages would stop. And so when you were listening to the clock and they gave you the exact minute, you didn't know what minute it was. It was just that minute, last minute, and you would hear click, 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 click. When that click came, that indicated it's the first minute of a new hour. It didn't matter where in the country you were, because electricity travels at the speed of light. So if it's here or California, it's the same time, essentially. You can't tell the difference. And So everybody on the line knew the exact time, and all these station masters were required to be looking at their clocks when time was broadcast, and when they heard that click, they knew that that clock better read, you know, what that hour, that minute, that second, or their clocks were on. And they could make the adjustment, which when the railroaders came in, knew they had the correct time. And it was all across the whole system. So problem solved, right? This is that switchboard that I told you about, and the devices for sending clicks on the telegraph line. So, as I told you, everybody was interested in what noon is. I mean, on a sundial, you could even make your own sundial. You stand there, farmers out, they know what direction they have to face. The sun is behind them. They look down on the ground. The shadow is in the right direction. Okay, it's noon. You know, that was it. They could estimate time. However, when this time system started being broadcast, every place in the world, in the United States, was interested in knowing what noon was. And so what developed is city times. And so across the United States, there were over 80 different times, because everybody wanted their city to, I mean, Steubenville was 3 minutes after Pittsburgh. I mean, so what good did it do if you didn't know what their time was? It's good as long as you're in your state, in your city. And these numbers actually tell you what times it were, what time it was in different cities. You know, I could read them to you, but I think it's a little bit boring, but they're all over the place. Philadelphia is different. Columbus is 13 minutes different later. Altoona is, I think, 10 minutes earlier. You know, it's all over the place. So, time broadcast from Allegheny Observatory on the north, on the old Allegheny Observatory, began to this station in Pittsburgh. So, this is Grant Street. This is a Pittsburgh station. This is Grant. This is Liberty. So that's where the present station is. And I know the very specific period of time that this photograph was taken. It was between 1865, when the station was built, and 1877, July, I think 19th. We could date it that well, when the station was burned down in the 1877 railroad riots. This building and almost every railroad building from 7th Street all the way up to 33rd Street were demolished. The roundhouse, 100 some locomotives, 1,000 cars. It was a bad thing. And so I actually did work for Walsh Beardsley, and what he's saying is, as best we know, the Allegheny system is the foundation for all time systems in the United States. So there's this two-tiered time system that started because the railroad had to keep schedules, and their schedules are across lots of cities. And for instance, the Pennsylvania Railroad had stations from New York to Chicago. So they had to have a time to make schedules for them. Whereas the cities chose to do something, they want to stay with the mean solar time. So this timetable here is for Steubenville, Ohio. And you'll see the left column says city time, the right says railroad time. So if you're going to catch a train, you got to read what your watch says, and then you have to look at what the schedule says, comparing, and that's what time you go down to get the train. It's especially bad when you were going to go to someplace, say Columbus, and you were going to change trains to Newark Center. I don't know. doesn't really matter. And New York Central's time is based on this city, and Pennsylvania Railroad lines west is based on this city, and the schedules are by that time. And so you look at the two different schedules and say, okay, I could get off of this train on the PRR and go onto New York Central, and I have 10 minutes to spare at that station. Well, their schedule is based on another city that's minutes off. You know, it's bad for travel. So it just didn't work. It wasn't very friendly back then to travel by train because of these differences in time. And Langley wrote to this. He talks about he riding a train from Boston, and he says, there is no watch available that you could use to account for that, because you're passing through Philadelphia and New York, and every one of them have a different time. So whatever watch you wear, it's no good, because unless you're talking about the railroad itself, it doesn't do you any good. So we even have a curator of time. I don't know if she's still there at the Smithsonian, so we pay somebody to do the creator of time job, curator of time. And she, in fact, says the Pennsylvania Railroad was probably the first major railway to systematically govern timekeeping. There were lots of different railroads in Pittsburgh that were part of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and this is just a partial list of them. Pennsylvania Railroad ended at the station. It stopped right there. It didn't go any further, and it did go further on railroads that were controlled by them, or leased, owned by them, or leased by them, like the Fort Wayne, Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago outside here, which were also broken up into lots of railroads. This is just to indicate that Pittsburgh was the division point. I won't bore you with the details of it. And so what happened is the railroads got together and they put together something called a General Time Convention from the American Railway Association. Was in charge of coordinating scheduling for railroads so that they get it straightened out. It was in charge of resolving the time discrepancy between railroads. And I'll tell you this, it really gets complicated, because one of the questions that they ask the other railroads is, who do you hold responsible? In other words, who do you blame for a rear-end collision at stations? The train that's standing at the station and the train approaching, or the train approaching it. Now, if you're stopped at a traffic light and somebody hits you in the rear end, you're saying that's their fault. But that's not the case on railroads. Because if a train standing in the station was supposed to leave 10 minutes before that, they could be held responsible. So it's rules are complicated. So what they came out with is something called standard time. In 1883, it went into effect. They divided the country, North America, into 5 time zones. We don't normally talk about intercoastal, but Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. The government had absolutely nothing at all to do with that. This is an agreement between railroads. So they made the agreements. Now you could join or you could not, but most people chose to. So standard time began at the downtown station in Pittsburgh. So this Union Station, this is a photograph around 1902. And so because the Pennsylvania Railroad it would be more sense to them, because the Pennsylvania Railroad ended at the station in Pittsburgh. So if they could force this issue, that Central Time began in Pittsburgh, they could put all the PRR into one time zone and make schedules, and everybody's all, it's perfect. Whereas west of Pittsburgh, on the Panhandle, which went through Columbus and St. Louis, and Fort Wayne through Sewickley here, it could be on another schedule and another time. So they were powerful enough railroad to be able to force that issue. And so when time started in standard time started in 1883, the Central Time Zone began in Pittsburgh. How do I know that? Well, this is a Federal Street station. It was a beautiful station. Dutch Renaissance architecture, very nice station. And I was looking at this picture, I've been interested in it, and I blew it up. I got a photograph, finally, that I could blow up and read what that clock tower said. I was wondering. It says Central Time. So my conclusion was, okay, the face on the left said Eastern Time. This face said Central Time. The one behind said Mountain Time, and the other one said Pacific Time. I thought. Until I got this picture. And you see that the clock tower said Central Time, Central Time, Central Time, Central Time, because this was the first station outside of Pittsburgh. It's 9/10 of a mile away from the one in downtown that was in the Central Time Zone. And if you look at schedules that they used to publish in magazines and newspapers every day and everything like that, if you look at the top left one, Allegheny Valley, it mentions standard time, Eastern Standard Time nearly 21 minutes faster than Pittsburgh time. And there's even a story in that 1 minute. The Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago, Central Time, 40 minutes slower than Pittsburgh. Because of the railroad riots, the Pennsylvania Railroad did not give a damn about Pittsburgh. They just said, we leave by Eastern Time. They didn't tell the difference. There was still this problem with the riots they blamed on Pittsburgh. And so for many years, there was this animosity. It existed before the railroad riots and after the railroad riots. So if you see that blue line, that's exactly where the Central Time Zone began. Okay? So guess what? City of Pittsburgh said, there is no way you're going to split our city into two different time zones at 11th Street. You know, so it didn't go over too well. So what happened is they for a while, if you were going to catch a train from the Pittsburgh station on the PRR, other stations in Pittsburgh, some took Central Time, some took Eastern Time, so it depended on railroads. You had to know 3 times. You had to know which direction you were traveling, and you had to know a whole bunch of stuff, because you looked at your city watch and then you said, well, I'm going east, so I'll go by Eastern Time, which is 20 minutes different. If I'm going west, even to the north side, I'd say, well, this schedule's by 20 minutes later, so I have to adjust myself for that. So it was very complicated. And it ended sometime around 1902, and I didn't look at the intervening times. But so it was very challenging to travel by train back then over a simple thing like time. And Pittsburgh city time ended with the city adopting Eastern Time. The Central Time ends in Pittsburgh with federally mandated daylight savings time, which was controversial then and is controversial today. They're always talking about, do we need daylight saving time? Do we not need? So that's when the federal government got involved and the time zone moved westward. It didn't move to Chicago immediately. It moved there, and I haven't been able to follow the steps. But the federal government said, well, if we have daylight savings time, we have an hour more of time to make things, to make things for the war effort. Yeah. Well, why don't you just tell them to get up an hour earlier or come to work an hour later? Anyhow, so the PR ended, and I failed to mention, this is something I failed to mention. If you were going to use the time system, the time signals, you had to pay for it. You had to pay to know the right time. Yes. So this was, time was sold, and the observatory, Allegheny Observatory, was 100% supported by the sale of time as early as 1872, 73. I mean, I've seen the records of talking about it. And most of the proceeds from the sale of time were used to buy batteries, because there's no electric lines up there, so they had to have batteries, and they wore out, and so you had to maintain them, and that's how you got the electricity to put the signal out on the telegraph line. So, and even beyond that, like a jewelry store might buy time from the observatory. And you say, why would a jewelry store do that? It's because part of the sales gimmick that they would use is, if you buy this watch from me, then I'll let you come into my store anytime you want to set your watch. It sounds stupid, but just think if you have a grandfather clock at home, and so you have your employees, if you have a big home, and you have your employees wanting to cut some time off, if they could open that clock up and move the dial a little bit, then how do you get back to the right time? It's really, really complicated. So purchase of time signals from Allegheny for the PRR ended in 1921, and the time signal era at Allegheny Observatory ended in 1946 because the city stopped buying time. They used to buy time for the clock tower at the old City Hall, which is on Smithfield Street. So it's a long story. It takes a lot of turns, and it has to do with Allegheny Observatory and Thaw and Langley. And, Langley High School was named for Langley. Langley Air Force Base is named for Langley, but not Langley, Virginia.
Do we have any questions for Ken? I think your subject was too complicated. Over that again. You have to come back next week. Here we go.
How did we finally just get it all settled across the world?
Geez, I don't know. I don't know. This kind of idea already started in England. That's why Greenwich Observatory was started. That's where they started getting the accurate time from. But England was so small that all of England was in the same time zone, even though it's not. It's, every 15 degrees of the earth is a different time zone. But, even in the United States, that if you look at the line for Central Time, it's all crooked and everything like that. And not everybody had to take daylight savings time. I think Arizona still does not do daylight savings time. Hawaii doesn't do it. Indiana didn't used to do it. They do it
there were
now.
3 that.
Indiana now occurs.
they did? Okay.
I lived in Indiana for a while, and sometimes, when I drove from work in Chicago, I changed time zones, and if with daylight savings time and Indiana wasn't participating, then the times would become. I had a guy came in late, a supervisor. He lived in the town where they wrote The Wizard of Oz, and he said Bass Lake is where he lived. And he said, I forgot it was different. They changed time. That's valid.
Now, railroad schedules.
Yes.
A question about railroad schedules. When did printed railroad schedules start? And did they actually buy the time then to the various railroads to print the schedules?
Well, I've seen schedules in the 1850s. I mean, the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad, which is the predecessor of this railroad out here, started running trains in 1851, I believe. I think they had schedules for it then. And it only ran between here and New Brighton for a while. And then it ran into Ohio, as far as Crestline. But no, yes, they did have schedules, but it just said this is what time our train is leaving. I don't know what time to go.
So they set their own time.
They set their own time, yeah.
This 4 minutes a day that we lose every year, and you didn't mention leap year,
It has nothing to do with leap year.
nothing.
No.
Where does this 4 minutes go then?
Leap year has to do with the fact that the orbit of the Earth is in 365 days.
Yeah,
It's, so every 4 years they have leap seconds,
yeah.
They could tell, if there's an earthquake, they could tell that the Earth, this 6 seismometers, they could tell that the Earth has changed its diameter slightly, and now the time has changed slightly, and they can tell you how much time that is. So, the leap year has to do with the fact that the Earth does not go around every 365 days.
Well, where's this 4 minutes go then? That you lose every day?
It doesn't go anywhere, because we're still, the sun is what we live by, and so we still go by the sun. And it gets made up once a year if it's a 24-hour clock, and twice a year if it's not. So it just became, those two different times become the same time.
Clear as mud.
Yeah. And you thought it was all simple. I mean, what am I talking about time for? Yeah, it's not easy. It's very complicated, and the reasons for it are very complicated as well.
We have another question.
I got a question. In the 1970s, I was a volunteer fireman in New York City, in southern Queens, Kennedy Airport, down around that area. And the firehouse was 150 years old. So our original time, alarm system would, you pull the box, we would get it in clicks. And you had to listen, you get the bang, 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 and then you had to start listening. There were 4 separate clicks, bang as first click, and then it would run off another series of clicks, little space, another set of click, 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 click. And then you had to look on a long chart where that click, click, click was, so you could find out where that box was, so you could drive to it. But they never changed the system. Now, the city fire system, you had a DOD, they would just call it in. But man, we had to count the clicks.
Well, that's the problem with doing this, getting this all set up. Well, Langley had the good idea of just adjusting standard clocks over one telegraph line. People want to earn money. Who won? People earning money.
Okay, any more questions for Ken? Ken, great program, very interesting topic, and thanks for coming. Okay, enjoy.